So we started to look at what the internal structure of the noun phrase, where we use noun phrase to mean that object that would be in the subject slot of a sentence, and the sentence would be characteristically made up of at least a subject and a verb phrase. That's the basic structure. Going back to forever in grammar, the idea is there's a subject and a predicate, and the predicate is generally verb phrase. Not necessarily, but that would be the case in, at least in most cases in English, that would be true. And then we have, we have some idea of what the internal structure of the noun phrase would look like, and we motivated calling it a determiner phrase, the idea being that there's usually a determiner right at the front, and it makes some sense to do it that way. Not the only way that you could do it, but it makes some sense. And then we began to motivate this idea that there would be characteristic skeleton structure that would be inside of all kinds of phrases, and for which there would be a theory called X-bar theory. So then we want to now kind of start to flesh out the rest of the structure, and we know that that can be very complex. You could have things as complex as this, right? But the basic idea is that there will be, you could have an auxiliary verb as well, and that would be a very typical sort of structure for English. We'll often have auxiliary verbs, and then you have the verb phrase with a head that will come first. Usually, there are some other things that can go inside the verb phrase that could precede the verb, but the typical scenario is that the verb is at the beginning of the phrase, for which reason English would be considered to be a language of the type that has heads first. That's actually another kind of motivation for doing the noun phrase the way that we do. If you look across languages, you find that languages that have verbs first in the verb phrase will have articles first in the noun phrase. And then, so the way that we make sense of that is that, well, the noun phrase is a DP. The D comes first. It's first inside of that phrase. Okay, so we have some kind of structure like this, and then we notice that there's the part of the grammar of English we have to understand right from the start is the way that auxiliaries work with respect to the clause structure. So we have auxiliaries outside of the verb phrase, and they have a relationship with the form of the verb. So the syntactic features of the verb are constrained by the auxiliary. If we take another auxiliary, here we have, if we take could, would be another kind of thing that could go in the same slot. If we do that, then the verb cannot stay the same, right? We have to change the verb because we now have a different kind of auxiliary, and we have to change the verb to its infinitive or bare form, right? So you have to have some kind of control over what's going on there. You have to understand what's going on there in order to really do anything with English grammar. You can also have more than one auxiliary, so we're going to have to find a way to get these all in here, right? You can have could have been telling, and the form that you have to have there telling is a function of the last auxiliary in the string. Could requires that the verb form after it be in the bare or infinitive form. That's why you get have. And then have requires that the verb following it be in the past participle form, or the perfect participle. There's different ways of different terms they could call it, but it's a participle form of some kind. And then the verb be is going to want the verb to be in the present participle or ing form, right? So that's kind of the stuff. So we have different verb forms. There's a whole bunch of, so here we've got a fairly complex set of inflectional forms for the verbs. And you can, in a lot of cases, the forms overlap, so that makes it difficult. So the past tense form can sometimes be the same as the past participle form, depending on the verb. Take, took, taken has 3 different forms, right? but there are other verbs that wouldn't have, you could have, for example, walk, present, bare form, past tense form, walked, and past participle form, he has walked here, would be in the, there would be, those forms wouldn't be different. But so we know what the forms are by looking at verbs that display the full range of differences. And the only one that really, the only ones that have the full range of differences are be and well, actually, no. Be is the only one that displays a difference for each of these different forms, because the infinitive form for be is different than any of the other forms, right? With do, for example, you have a past tense form, you have a past participle form, you have the progressive participle or present participle will always be ing, but not every verb would have that form. And then you have negative forms, the nt form, but that would only, those forms, notice how it works. The nt form is only going to go with the class of verbs. So the overall class of verbs here, we're considering that to include auxiliary verbs. That's one kind of verb. It's a subclass, just like we have nouns, we have mass nouns, plural nouns, singular nouns, and all of that, right? Where the mass versus count is really only a semantic feature that has syntactic ramifications. There's no inflection for that. But we have the same kind of subclass of things like singular, plural within the within verbs and so forth. So we have auxiliary verbs and what are called regular or main verbs often. Right? Okay, and then there are some restrictions. Only the nt suffix can only go on the auxiliary verb. So that's actually a good test. Do I know if I have an auxiliary or not? Can I put int on you? The modal subclass of auxiliary verbs, can, could, may, will, and so forth, don't have an infinitive or any participial forms. There's no ing form for those, right? Coulding, willing. Willing would be a different thing, right? That would be the verb to will something into existence, which clearly is the same verb at some level, but the one that goes in the modal auxiliary slot wouldn't be able to do that. And so forth. Okay, so we have different subclasses, and we can distinguish these things by virtue of the properties that they have, just like we can do with anything else. So he sang into song is absolutely impossible, right? It would be true in general also that the negative particle not will also only go after auxiliaries, not after main verbs. So that's another kind of difference, right? Although it's not as bad, right? And you could do it if you have the not that's negating the rest of the phrase that comes after, then you might think that you've got that, right? So you could say, he sang not the song that I wanted him to, but the other song. Well, that's different. The not is negating the phrase that comes after it. Well, yeah, sure. You used to be able to do this, right? So what happened historically was that all of them, this is what happens in languages, right? Verbs that have rich meanings will, over time, come to have those meanings, some of them, and it's a fairly well-defined class, will have those meanings get bleached out and they'll come to be grammatical, some kind of grammatical form. And eventually they can end up being a grammatical morpheme that gloms onto a verb. But those things come from full verbs. If you go back to Old English, these were, there was no distinction between the modal verbs and the rest of the verbs and stuff. There was no reason to have an auxiliary verb category. And you could put the negative particle after main verbs. And main verbs, the distinction just wasn't there. There are some remnants of that that you can find like in Shakespearean language and so forth, right? He spoke not to, yeah, Shakespearean, right? So it was a gradual process whereby these things change. And the way it works is that will meant something like want, right? And you still see the remnants of that, as in, I guess you could say, I willed that to happen, right? Where it has a little bit more of a strength than just the meaning want. But want, the verb want, will be one of the things that languages will go to in order to have future markers, future grammatical morphemes, future auxiliaries. They'll also go to go and come for whatever reason, right? Come can also be used to mark future stuff. So these things are regular processes that happen in lots of languages. And then you can, only an auxiliary verb can precede the subject of a sentence in a yes-no question. So he has sung a song. Has he sung a song? Where would be a question. He sang a song. Sang he a song? But of course, again, in Shakespearean. Said you not that you probably said thee not. I don't know, whatever it would be, right? You have some stuff like that. And then the auxiliary do has a certain set of special properties that include that it doesn't ever co-occur with other auxiliaries, right? Do as an auxiliary verb, now you have to be careful, right? Do can be a main verb, right? In things like, I did my homework. And it's but you can see the process that occurs in languages. Do my homework has the main verb, do, and that one is a very good one and the kind of thing that languages go to. Verbs like that mean things like make or do will become auxiliary verbs of some kind over time. And this one is actually, and they can coexist as being one and the other. The same thing with have, right? Have is an auxiliary verb when you say things like, I have done my homework. But you could also have, well, if you said, I had a good time last night, then the only verb in there is have, right? And it won't behave. It won't have the properties of an auxiliary, right? Because you wouldn't say, I hadn't a good time last night, right? No, can't put "nt" on it. You couldn't make that into a question. And so forth. So we have different properties here. Only a verb, only a auxiliary verb, and I'm putting this "vox" here just so that we're aware of what the category is. And as we flesh this out, we'll probably just get rid of that and say it's some kind of verb, and it's defined by its inherent properties, demanding a certain kind of complement and so forth. Only an auxiliary verb can be preceded by, or cannot be preceded by "vox" do in a yes-no question as well, right? So the do one has special properties. Another thing that we note, and here we're starting to get into how we can know something about the internal structure of the clause based on things that can happen. So if we look at the verb phrase ellipsis construction, we take something like this: he wasn't singing those songs, but his brother was singing those songs. We probably wouldn't say it that way, right? How would we say it? But his brother, because it's the same, those things are the same, we just get rid of that part, right? So that's the verb phrase ellipsis phenomenon that has been used to as one of the kinds of evidence that one would have for what the internal structure of the clause is. We observed, and we did this with the noun phrase, we observed that the things that can be elided, that can be left off, and that can get their interpretation from other things that have just come before are, in general, phrases of some kind. So this gives strong evidence for the claim that there is a verb phrase, and the auxiliary verb is outside of that. He likes singing those songs, but his brother hates singing those songs. What can we do here? We can't do that, right? So we have, well, here we have hates with some kind of a phrase that goes after it, but not okay to, we know there's a phrase that goes after it, right? But we can't just elide that because why? Because here's another property that distinguishes auxiliary verbs from other verbs. Auxiliary verbs are the only ones that license the verb phrase ellipsis possibility. So if we have his brother, he likes movies with violence, but his brother hates movies with violence, then we can't do that, right? But we can do that, right? So there are ways of fixing it. And the way you fix it in this case is to put in a pronoun, right? You can't, the rule is, that's not verb phrase ellipsis because you don't have a verb phrase, you have a DP or noun phrase in that slot, and we don't allow DP ellipsis in general in this kind of situation. Whole DPs, English does not like to elide them. Other languages have no problem. English doesn't like to do that. You have to put a pronoun instead. And then so we have modal auxiliaries. They must come first if there's more than one. Might have been singing. You can't put that in any other combination. Require the following verb to be in its infinitive form. Might be happy. Do not have participial or infinitive forms themselves. Have, on the other hand, requires that the verb be, the thing following it be in the past participial form. Be requires present or past participle form. Is singing, was taken, but which of those you have gives you a different meaning. When you have the ing form, the present participle form, then you've got the meaning of present progressive, or the progressive participle, or whatever. When you have the other form, then you get the passive sentence meaning, right? The book was stolen. He is stealing the book. Two different kinds of things. And then dummy do requires the infinitive form following it, and shows up only in the absence of all other kinds of things. Okay, so we keep that in mind. We have auxiliary verbs versus main verbs. There are plenty of cases that we can find where the evidence about whether something is an auxiliary verb or a main verb can be complex and difficult. The most complex one is the verb be, because no matter when it shows up, it behaves like which one? Like an auxiliary verb, right? So if you take something like, he is tall, what's the main verb? The boy is tall. Is there a main verb? Well, everyone would say yes, right? And what is that main verb? Is. Does it behave like a main verb or like an auxiliary? Give me an example. Somebody give me some evidence. What would be the evidence bearing on this?
He isn't tall.
Is he tall? Move it to the front, right? He isn't tall can be inflected with "nt." He is not tall. Fine, right? He's tall, but his brother isn't. With ellipsis after it. It licenses ellipsis. And then it doesn't even care whether it's a verb phrase or not. It licenses ellipsis with whatever comes after it, right? And so it has all of the properties of an auxiliary verb, no matter what. So then, what do we have there? Is it a main verb or an auxiliary verb? Main verb, you can insist on that, right? But it's completely unclear. I'll probably maybe that's a good homework assignment. Work out the details. Because notice what people will do. They'll say, well, then you don't have any verb. And then what do you have to give up? If you say, oh, well, it's an auxiliary, then you give up something, right? If the structure is, the boy is smart, then, and you have is as an auxiliary verb, then you give up something that, some assumption that you usually have about clauses, which is that they have verb phrases, right? Or maybe you don't, but what would you have to do? You would have to say, well, something happens here and there's some invisible stuff going on, and there really is a verb phrase, but there is an empty verb in it, right? Why would there be? So there's lots, that's the way that the thinking about this goes, right? Another way of doing it would say, well, okay, whatever. You don't have to have verb phrases, right? That would be another solution to the problem, and there are all kinds of stories about that out there, and it sort of depends on what you want to say. Okay, so here, let's just go through some of the really basic notions of phrase structures. So we have structures like this, not without here, I'm not giving all of the elaborate detail, just keeping the structures fairly simple, just so we're clear on what the different kinds of terminology are that we encounter when we talk about these things. And so here I'm giving sort of definitions for really common concepts about these structures, these objects that we call phrase structures. One of the ideas is domination. And in these definitions, I'm doing sort of standard kind of quasi-logic kind of definitions, kind of like making it kind of mathematical. And so we have variables, x and y, where those can be, give me anything, but if x is going to have the same value throughout. Y is going to have and so forth, right? So that's it's sort of a notation like that. So any node x in a phrase structure tree dominates y, if and only if y is contained in x. So we have, here's a node, here's a tree. What does S dominate? Well, everything, right? It dominates the DP and the VP because those are contained within it. So a node is going to define a domain in which there are things inside of it. And anything inside of it is dominated in it. So all of those nodes are going to be dominated by S, right? The VP node is going to dominate those, the V and the PP and other ones as well, right? All of those things, but it's not going to dominate any of those. That's a pretty simple notion, right? Has to do with the metaphor of containment, things that are parts, right? Things that are parts of something are shown via the lines that connect them. Okay, what else? Immediate domination just means, well, read the definition. It means the next one down in terms of nodes, and that's it. So the VP node immediately dominates only those nodes, not any of the other. Immediate domination just is that. So those nodes are dominated by VP, but not immediately dominated, right? The notion mother, X is Y's mother, if and only if X immediately dominates Y. So these are just terms that are used in the literature that can be defined in terms of domination. And what else do we have? Well, daughter, of course, is the opposite. Daughters of a node are its things that it immediately dominates. And we don't, by the way, we could, right? But it's not common to talk about granddaughters and nephews and nieces. So the terminology only goes so far. And those would be sisters. So when we talk about the sisters of, so two nodes that have the same mother are sisters. It's pretty simple, right? And there are no fathers for whatever reason. And then we want the notion of constituent. Something is a constituent of something else if it's part of it, basically, is all that that's all. This all just boils down to. Or a single part of it, right? So you wouldn't say, well, we'll go through some examples, right? The PP is a constituent of the VP and of S, right? Because the VP is a constituent of S. and S dominates that PP. If S dominates you, then you're part of that, right? And this is a constituent because it's a whole single part. That's what the function of those phrasal nodes is. So it's an immediate constituent of only the VP. Room is a constituent of a bunch of things, but only an immediate constituent in this tree, the way we've drawn it, of the DP, of the DP node that is its mother, right? So single words can be constituents because they're single parts of something. But usually when we're using the notion of constituent, we're interested in thinking about what the phrasal constituents are, because those are the things that have to be identified and that are in many cases not entirely, it's not entirely obvious what the constituency is. For this would not be a constituent of anything, right? Because it's just simply not a single part. It is two pieces that are adjacent to each other, two parts, but they themselves do not they don't define a single part by themselves. And this is also not a constituent of anything because it's not a single part. It's part of the VP, right? But that's only that doesn't. The DP and the PP together don't themselves make up completely a single part, right? They're two of three of the parts, right? It's pretty simple notion. Okay. So then when we have these ideas, what we then want to do, and we're going back here to classic generative transformational grammar, where this stuff was all discovered, what the basic structure of sentences is by means of applying certain kinds of tests about constituents. So we've talked about these things already. We're just going to go through some more and take it deeper and see what some of the things are that we can say about the elaborate structure of VPs. So the proform criterion or the proform test, a proform must have a constituent as its antecedent. That's the assumption we're working with. We have lots of evidence for it. So that boy took the dog into his room, and he took it there yesterday. He takes as its antecedent, thing that gives it its value, that boy. It takes the dog, and there takes into his room as its antecedent. So, and there are different kinds. You have there being a proform that takes a PP, typically at least, maybe not always, but typically takes a PP designating a location only, not any PP. It has to be a locational one. Another kind of thing that we get is the it-cleft construction, or sometimes just called the cleft construction. The boy took the dog into his room, and then we have a construction that we can build out of that same basic a sentence where we add on, and originally this was thought of as being a transformation that said, okay, give me any sentence as input, add this other stuff on there. And the exact details of what that structure would be are being ignored here because it's complicated. But the basic nature of the construction is that you have an it that is a dummy pronoun it, doesn't get its value from something that came earlier, or something you can point to or anything like that. It's just there because this construction needs it to be that way. And then you have a form of the verb be, and then you have, this is the important thing, you have a focus slot, the complementizer that, and the rest of the sentence. And then what you do is you move something, you take a piece out of the sentence and put it in the focus slot. So what this construction is doing, and languages all have something like this in one way or another. They might only do it with intonation pattern. English combines both things. There's a certain intonation pattern here, as well as particular construction. Okay, so you take any of the constituents that are phrasal is going to be the constraint here, basically. And to make this good, you might have to put, because what you're doing is giving a phrase in that sentence contrastive focus. I'm saying, you told me it was the cat that the boy took the cat in his room. I say, no, it was the dog that the boy took into his room, not the cat, right? That would be, it's a way of negating something in a sense, right? So there's contrastive focus on it. We could do the same thing with the PP. It was into his room that boy took the dog, right? Because that's a whole piece of the sentence. It goes into that focus position without any problem. You can't do this without, you have to be aware, there are certain constraints. You can't do it with every kind of phrase. You cannot do this with the verb phrase. Even though we know the verb phrase for lots of other reasons is a whole constituent, this construction does not allow you to focus on verb phrases. It also doesn't allow you to focus on phrases that are embedded down deeply inside of prepositional phrases. It depends on what the structure is. This is looking for main constituents of the sentence, except the VP. It doesn't want that one, right? It was the boy that took the dog in his room. It was the boy that took the dog. That's fine, right? But you can do it that way. It was dog into. No good, right? So here's why we say that there are constituents. There are things, a bunch of things, a bunch of constructions that show us what are the constituents. We say it's really absolutely horrible to do certain kinds of things. And then, well, we don't know. The dog into his room, actually, for some people, that would be a constituent because they want it to be, because it, or whatever, but there's no support for that being. You can't say, this means it's not a constituent, but this construction does not support it being a constituent, right? It was the dog into his room that the boy took. Is no good, right? That suggests that maybe is not a constituent. That's why it's shown in that tree as not being one. The pseudo-clef construction has very similar, but it has somewhat different constraints. So the way it works is you put a WH word or a question word, what, where, how, any of them, pretty much, I guess, right? All by itself, and I'm going to say that that's a pronoun, and pronouns are Ds, that therefore head DPs, is in that slot up there. Although that's something that one would have to eventually would have to provide evidence for and so forth, right? But it's clearly something that can have a relationship with DPs. It's actually not constrained to that in that sense, but it will work that way. So anyway, we put a question word up there, and then we put the form of the verb be on the right side, and then we put the focus slot way over to the right. And this is a fairly common thing. Languages will often put phrases in focus at the ends of sentences rather than at the beginning. And then we can take constituents from within the sentence and put them in the focus slot, right? What the boy took into his room was the dog, fine, right? Where the boy took the dog was into his room, fine, right? So notice we have to shift the question word at the beginning. It might have to be shifted in order to match it's in some kind of a relationship with the thing in focus, right? It's getting its value from the thing in focus. And so it has to be consistent with that. Whether where is, it's probably not a DP, but probably a PP, where where is actually a P within an intransitive PP is probably what it actually is. But that's another matter. We're just focusing on this thing. So took the dog into his room. Here we have the verb phrase. Can we put it in that slot? Yeah, as long as we add the auxiliary verb do in that slot. So there's a something else we need to do in order to focus on a verb phrase. And what that entails is what? This is not actually grammatical, right? Like that, right? As written, it's not grammatical because the verb is in the wrong form, but then we just go back to the grammar, and the grammar says, oh, do, sorry, got to have the verb in the verb phrase after me. I'm auxiliary do. I've got to be in the infinitive form, so that's just an automatic shift we do to make that happen. Right? Yeah?
Can you do something similar?
Like what?
Say it was the taking the dog.
Sure, but then that would be, it would be you've transformed that he did. It was the taking the dog into. I don't think they can do that, but
it's the same thing.
Yeah, sure, but you would have to do a bigger change there, right? And here you can actually. I don't know if my next slide would do it, but I'm doing this with did to just show you how it works, right? But you could do it with an input sentence that has another auxiliary. The auxiliary is already there, and then the exact form of the verb phrase would still be able to be in focus, right? So yeah, you could say there's a little bit of a trick like that, right? But the only trick it is that automatic stuff that has to happen happens, right? You cannot have any kind of because actually think about it. What this is a combination of. It's actually two things going on here, right? Combination of ellipsis and a copy of the ellipse thing being put over to the right. And so therefore it's automatic if you're going to do verb phrase ellipsis that the do has to go in there, right? And then automatically, just because that's the way the grammar works, right? You do. Whereas the other thing you were talking about, I'm sure there's a way of doing that. That requires stuff that isn't automatic in any way, right? That's not just a consequence of doing that sort of thing. But I guess you could look at it that, yeah. In fact, if you go back far enough in classic generative transformational grammar, noun phrases like the one you just made up would be transformed. Transformation from a verb phrase would turn it into a noun phrase, right? And so, yeah, you could do that in some worlds. Yeah. Yeah.
What it does.
Sure. Yeah, there has to be a match of some kind between the form of the verb be, and so I'm ignoring all of that stuff, right? But there is some kind of match between the form of the verb be and what the form of the verb phrase is, right? There's got to be some kind of. Well, I'm not actually sure what the constraint is, but yeah, you can shift that around depending on what you. Oh, I see. The auxiliary and the verb be have to be a match?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it probably does, right? What the boy does, because it wouldn't. What the boy does was, no, that's not going to work, right? They have to be matching, I think. I never thought about this one. And it has to be what the boy. Yeah, it has to always match, right? Doesn't it? Okay, so another some kind of a. I don't know if that's a semantic or grammatical constraint, but yeah, there's a constraint there. What the boy did into his room was take the dog. Is this good? Well, so here we've got a phrase that can't undergo it, right? So it's not everything that can do it. It's going to depend on the situation. Because you have to have what here, right? And there's no where is probably what the problem is, right? You have to do the pseudo-clef construction with, well, no, you can do it with where. Okay? Where the boy, well, where the boy took the dog was into his room. That would be fine, right? So you would repair it that way. Okay, you also can get topicalization, where you would take the whole prepositional phrase, for example, and just move it to the front. Fairly simple thing. This is something that most dialects of English doesn't really like to do very much. But you could do it if you set it up right. Then it could work by doing something like that. So this works best with prepositional phrases, but not so much with DP. So in her room, Sally has 3 pictures of me. That's fine. At my school, we always spend a lot of time on grammar. That guy, we all like a lot. Could do it that way, right? Can you? That guy, we all like a lot, but that's not the way I would do it. I would do it like this, where I would put a pronoun in that slot. So you could say it's the same thing, but we've got, and then if you go and you look in the literature, they would call, without the pronoun, it would be topicalization. With the pronoun, help me here, Kristen, I'm getting old, it would be left dislocation. In her, Sally has 3 pictures of me room. Absolutely not. Her room, Sally has 3 pictures of me in. Well, I guess that's probably too strong to say ungrammatical. Not very good, though. But you can do it with things like this, depending on what the structure is. That guy, Sally took a picture of. It's fine, right? So you can pull things out of prepositional phrases under some set of constraint that people have looked at in all kinds of ways. Though movement, so there's a bunch of them. I'm not going to give you all of them, right? But just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people were looking at. I might finish this book someday, single word, right? That might be some and day that have been smushed together somehow or other, right? Or maybe not. Could be just a D. This is not a simple problem. Just an N. Is someday just an N or some, it's, there's another homework assignment. In fact, something probably came up in the first homework assignment, right? There was a translation from Portuguese that had something separate, right? And in English, it had a weird property that have the same meaning, but the some and the thing are all smushed together. And then when you do that, what's interesting, right, is that the adjective goes after it, right? Something good. Some good thing, something good, kind of the same thing, but you get the adjective after it, so something therefore is what? Adjectives always go before the nouns in the DP, right? But we get something good. So something therefore must be a D, right? Or not, yeah.
Why isn't some?
It is. I'm just putting it there. It's somewhere in the sentence. I'm not saying it's not an adjective. It is an adverb. In terms of its meaning, it's an adjunct. It doesn't have to be there. But in terms of its form, is there any reason to say that it is a category adverb? There's no, because here's the deal. Lots of things can be adverbial in the sense that they're modifiers of verb phrases, right? They can be prepositional phrases. They can be adverb phrases, like very slowly, where slowly is a prototypical adverb, right? Would be a phrase. You could say, I might finish this book gradually, would be an adverb in traditional terminology, but I might finish this book after the movie would have a preposition, it would be just a prototypical structure for a prepositional phrase, right? So prepositional phrases can be adverbial, right? Does that make sense? And this is adverbial, but doesn't mean that it's a category adverb, right? Anyway, I'm not really focusing on that here, but you could do, though movement is kind of hard to come up with these. It's very, very literary kind of language, but it's interesting nonetheless. Here we can, and the reason that these crazy people that thought this stuff all out found it was they wanted to have lots of evidence for verb phrases. And this can be used to make decisions about what's a verb phrase or not in some cases. So we get, finish this book, though I might someday. I'll never be a real novelist. So you wouldn't be saying this kind of thing very often, but you do encounter things like this in literary text, right? And you could, there's this, I think I put this on a link to the chapter from this book on the website where you can see a bit more about this and more about other kinds of tests of constituency like this. The boy put on the bed his clothes is no good, right? The boy put on the bed his clothes. The boy put the clothes on his bed. It has to be that way, right? In ordinary situations, but we can, if we make that big enough, then it becomes uncomfortable there. And actually, the expert on this kind of phenomenon is our own Professor Hawkins, who has a whole theory of why you place things the way you do. And according to his theory, you try to make it be the case that you figure out what all the basic pieces are as soon as possible. And so how do you do that? You find the heads early. That's why the heads come first, right? Once I see a case of on, then I know, as a general rule, I've got a prepositional phrase, right? Once I see a case of a determiner, so I got the verb, I've got a verb phrase. I've heard that, I can make a calculation about what the sentence means, because that's what we're doing in actual practice. We're hearing sentences and we're making quick calculations about things, and we do that by taking all the cues that we get. And so what we want is we want to have as many cues as quickly as possible. Therefore, since the cue for a verb phrase is verb, put it first. Cue for a prepositional phrase, preposition, put it first, and so forth. Here the problem is that we don't know that there's a prepositional phrase until, well, we do actually in this case because it's put, and put has to have one, but nevertheless the general schema is we have to wait like hella long in order to get to on, right? And so what we do is move that one to the end, and we're able to make the calculation more quickly, right? So that would be the psychological or cognitive motivation for this happening. But this is a common phenomenon. Heavy NP shift or heavy DP shift or whatever. We can also do this with fleshing out a big DP. All the clothes that he's been wanting to get rid of for a long time, we're going to want to put that at the end, and so therefore we could do it like this is one way to do it, right? This would be extraposition from NP. We've got a relative clause inside of a noun phrase, inside of a DP. That's way too big. Let's just shift it to the end. We don't have to take the whole. So notice that you can do this in different ways. In this case, we're not taking the whole DP and shifting it to the end. We're taking the relative clause, which is relative clauses are almost always very heavy, full of stuff. Move those relative clauses as much as we can. Try to get relative clauses at the end, right? So, but notice that's a different the terminology is different. It's called extraposition. In this case, extraposition from NP. And then we have other things. PP ellipsis. Come along with us. But we're going to go to the beach. You should come along. It's fine, right? Come along. Notice it's kind of interesting, right? Because the interpretation of come along has to go with the subject of the sentence. So I say, the boy and the girl went to the beach, and Tad, just making up a random name here, went along. Then went along can't mean went along with me or with other things. It has to be, you have to get it from the interpretation is there. So that's what ellipsis does, right? Here's another case, that's all I'm pointing out. So it's fine to do ellipse a whole PP. But you can also, here's a case where you can apparently, and this is a case that would be called prodrop, maybe, or DP ellipses. For some speakers, I can't do this, but I know people can. We're going to go to the beach, you should come with, right? Apparently there's some dialects of English where this is just a routine. I think it's happening in California, but I don't know what the exact status. How many people can say this? How many people can? Oh, just the old people, I guess. Okay. We've done VP ellipsis, right? Why am I doing this here? Boy liked the dog, the girl didn't like the dog. We can ellipse it, right? But the girl didn't because we've got an auxiliary, makes it perfectly fine. We also have another version of this, which is do so anaphora. And do so, basically the deal here is that the combination of do and so, whatever that is, whatever that thing is, you could, maybe it's a compound, I don't know, whatever it is, it has the property of only being able to go in places where you have VPs. So the boy kicked the dog, but the girl didn't dog. We can either do ellipsis or we could do so, right? But the girl didn't do so. Would be fine, right? And there's certain cases where you'd have to do it that way. Okay, so we have do so and Afra. She ate a donut, and I did so too. He built a canoe with his bare hands, and I did so too. Means I built a canoe with, notice we have to do a kind of, it's not exactly the same content, but all of the meaning of that gets applied to, it would mean, so this would actually, this is called sloppy anaphora, because do so has the thing that means is not exactly the same as the thing it gets its value from syntactically, because you have to make the appropriate shifts, but that's a fairly straightforward thing to do. She likes donuts and I do so too. Horrible, right? So it's not any verb phrase that you can do this with. He believes that there's flat and I do so too. No, what would you do instead? And I do too, because you've got another alternative, which is VP ellipsis. VP ellipsis says, but you still got to put in the auxiliary, right? The do has to go in there. But there are constraints on these things. The constraint here is that do so only goes with verb phrases where the verb is one that involves some kind of activity, not a psychological state. So like and believe are psychological verbs or emotion verbs or whatever, right? Emotion or cognitive verbs. And they are, they're also actually what we would call stative verbs, whereas kick is, for example, would be an activity would involve some kind of activity. So it has to be an agent doing some activity in order to do so. Okay. My wife threw all her junk into my closet. We were trying to figure out what this is. We can, one hypothesis is this, threw her junk into my closet, call that hypothesis A. Another one would be this, my wife threw her junk into my closet, where we've got a prepositional phrase, and or some kind of a phrase, her junk, and then her junk is in the specifier slot of the prepositional phrase. So that's another possibility. And another one is this. And all of these things actually, in some form, have been proposed. So hypothesis C would say, we've got throw her junk is a subconstituent, right? Because remember, we're starting to, what I'm doing here is starting to look at what is that real structure of the verb phrase? What are all the slots that are in there? How many things can you pack in there? And how is it that you do that? And we're going to end up saying, yeah, we need X-bar theory, this theory where you have intermediate level verb phrases, smaller verb-like phrases inside of the verb phrase. And so maybe this is the case as well, right? So my wife threw her junk into my closet to get, so one piece is threw her junk, a bigger piece is threw her junk into my closet, and so forth. So then what we can do is, well, let's see. We have three different hypotheses. My wife, well, which one is right? What we want to do then is what? We want to go and use our tests of what are constituents to see if which one is right. So we go here. What my wife threw into my closet was her junk. Does that provide us any evidence at all? So we use the pseudo-clef construction. Does that provide us any evidence at all to decide between these hypotheses? No. It shows what? It shows, given all of the assumptions we have so far, it shows that her junk in this sentence is a constituent, right? But all of the hypotheses make the same claim about that, don't they? They all claim that her junk is a constituent. So that doesn't do us any good at all. Why am I going through this? Because I've taught this class for a long time, and if I give this as an exam question, students will get it wrong, right? Because because sometimes they fail to make the total calculation. So this is, if you gave me this as evidence for one hypothesis or the other, then you would get that wrong. And the same thing, that's no evidence. None of these things are any evidence that's evidence for her junk being a constituent, and that's all. What my wife did was throw her junk into my closet. Shows that throw her junk into my closet is a verb phrase. It's consistent with the hypothesis that's a verb phrase, but that is true under all of the hypotheses as well, right? So what do we want? Give me a piece of evidence that would bear on one of these. What we've got to do is to figure out, well, what are the differences between those, right? Where do they make crucial distinctions? So hypothesis A says that my junk into her closet is not a constituent, right? It also claims that, hypothesis A claims that through her junk is not a constituent, right? Whereas hypothesis B claims that her junk into my closet is a constituent, right? Which hypothesis A doesn't. Nor does hypothesis C, right? But hypothesis C claims that through her junk is a constituent, right? So those are the things we have to focus on. Again, no evidence at all. That's irrelevant. Under all the hypotheses, those are even under hypothesis B, right? there is a constituent that consists of into my closet. It's not a PP, so you might say, well, what if we found out that there can only have a whole PP as its antecedent? Then you would have evidence for ruling out hypothesis B, right? Does that make sense? But so far we haven't seen what the facts are. Do we know that that the proform there has to have a PP, a complete PP, and none of the subparts? We don't really know that yet. We'd have to see if there are structures of this sort and see what happens. But clearly both hypothesis A and hypothesis C are consistent with this evidence. So what we really want to focus on is things like this. What my wife did into my closet was throw her junk, which is not good, right? So that rules out hypothesis C, right? Hypothesis C is well, it doesn't rule it out. It's hypothesis C is doesn't give you an explanation for the ungrammaticality of that. You would expect that to be grammatical if hypothesis C, or you might expect it to be grammatical if hypothesis C were right. My wife could throw her junk in my closet, but she shouldn't do so into the trunk of my car. Same kind of problem, right? Maybe these aren't really maybe even all that bad, but they're not really good, right? So only hypothesis A would explain why these are bad. Because in hypothesis A, well, not just hypothesis A, but hypothesis A would explain the badness of this, right? But so would hypothesis B, actually, right? Because both of those claim, sorry, throw her junk is not a constituent, right? And so the hypothesis C fails to explain this, and therefore, all else being equal, we would reject hypothesis C. It makes the wrong prediction about what should occur. It predicts that you should be able to get that kind of thing. And then we're going to come back and look at cases where, yeah, verb phrases do have this kind of elaborate structure, and these constructions would pick out constituents of that form where they do exist. So we look here, what my right through was her junk into my closet. Hypothesis A claims, that's not a constituent, right? The badness of this is consistent with that. Hypothesis A gives us an explanation. It does not predict that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not the right, that it's the right analysis, but it at least makes the prediction that this should be bad, right? Whereas hypothesis, or at the same time, hypothesis C makes the same prediction. But hypothesis B, on the other hand, makes the wrong prediction with respect to sentences like this. So therefore, we have evidence for preferring hypothesis A, all else being equal, right? If we find more evidence, we might find some reason to reject hypothesis A and prefer one of the others, but the process for making the decision is like that. Her junk into my closet, my wife threw. We can't topicalize it, right? Or left dislocated or anything like that. So we get the wrong prediction from hypothesis B about a range of different structures. We got the wrong prediction from hypothesis C about others. And so we then would prefer hypothesis A. Okay, now, having done all that, we can then look at complicated sentences And what we find from doing that same kind of, by using that same kind of process of hypothesis testing, we end up with a verb phrase that can have complex structure of this exact kind, that is consistent with the basic schema of X-bar theory that I talked about last time, where the structure of phrases is going to be one in which you have heads, you have complements. The complements are there because the head, the meaning of the head makes them want to be there, or gives you them, sometimes requires them, and sometimes doesn't, right? So it isn't really clear that the complement thing is a tricky one, right? But we can use evidence of the kinds we've been just looking at to make some decisions. So here we have an adverb phrase that we'll call an AP cautiously. We have prepositional phrases that function adverbially, like we were just talking about after the movie on Thursday. So things that function adverbially will give you stuff like the manner in which something is done, the time at which it took place, the place in which it happened, and all of that stuff. All of these things are stuff you can just throw into almost any clause. Right? Give me any verb phrase as input, I can put on Thursday after it pretty much, right? Some cases would be a little bit weird or whatever, but you can almost always do that. So those things are what we would call adjuncts, right? They can go, and where they go in the tree structure is outside. They're not, here's the key thing, right? They're not sisters of the head. The adjuncts are all up higher, stacked up higher in the tree. The sisters of the head is give, right? So we have give the girl some flowers cautiously after the movie on Thursday. It's kind of a stupid sentence, right? But I'm going to give the girl some flowers cautiously. It's fine, right? We remember that you can only focus on phrasal constituents in the pseudoclef construction. And so we try that out. What he might do is, and what parts of it we want to know, what are the things that we can focus on? Give the girl some flowers cautiously after the movie on Thursday. It's fine, right? So the whole thing is a constituent of some kind, a verb phrase. And then we go, well, let's try some other things. That whole thing, you could say that V bar at that level is a constituent, or the whole VP is. You can look at it either way. What he might do on Thursday is give the girl some flowers cautiously after. It's fine, right? So that gives us the evidence for that part. That's why we're saying that we have a stacked structure of this kind, because what the pseudoclef construction allows you to focus on is not just whole verb phrases, but the claim is going to be any V bar within a verb phrase. And so that's going to also give us evidence about which things are complements and which things are adjuncts. Under the hypothesis that, as I said earlier, complements are sisters of the verb, right? Complements of a verb are its sisters. Adjuncts are farther out, not as closely related to it. So we go and we do what he might do after the movie on Thursday is give the girl some flowers cautiously. It's fine, right? And that's and there's some kind of relationship between the do and all of that, right? But there we're focusing on that V bar, right? And then we keep going, and then we that happened. What you might do cautiously after the movie on Thursday is give the girl some flowers. Fine, again, right? And then we try to take it further. What he might do the girl some flowers cautiously. Bad. Because our explanation is that give is not a phrasal constituent. The pseudo-clef construction wants a phrase. It wants a whole phrase. It wants a whole, it has to be a V-bar or a VP. That's it. Give is not a VP, it's just a V. It's a constituent, but it's just a single word constituent. What he might do some flowers cautiously after the movie's on Thursday is give the girl. No. No good, because again, the problem here is that those two, give and the girl, together do not make a subconstituent of the verb phrase. And that's why if we give it this kind of structure where complements must be instantiated as sisters of the verb, then we get a structure in which the verb and one of its complements does not make up a constituent all by itself. Right? You got the picture, right? So we could do this with pseudo-clef construction allows you to focus on a string headed by a V only if all the complements of the V are included in the string. And the kind of structure that we're showing here gives us a phrase structure account of why that is. Study physics at Harvard. We're going to want physics to be a complement, right? And at Harvard should be an adjunct, because you can say, what I'm going to do is study physics. And you don't have to say where, right? It's not a necessary thing that you have to bring up. So the reason is that ultimately it has to do with the meaning. So the meaning of study is do something, someone does something because they want to learn something about something. And the instantiations of the variables and the meanings correspond to pieces of the sentence. You have the subject, you have an object. The object, and we could say that they have roles like agent and theme, and the semantic roles. And the things that have semantic roles with respect to a verb are the things that are going to be its complement. Complements don't have to be, they're not necessarily obligatory. Because you could also say, I'm going to study at Harvard, couldn't you? But the complements are things that are have that sort of relationship. So we see. What I did was study physics at Harvard, that's fine, right? What I did at Harvard was study physics, fine. What I did, physics at Harvard, was study. No. Because why? Because everything is adding up to the conclusion that physics, and the general conclusion is going to be that when you have a subject and an object, the object, although notice it's optional, it doesn't have to be there, the object, if it's there, will be a complement. The subject, it's a different story because it's not contained in the verb phrase. It's a different sort of animal. So that's no good, right? What I did physics at Harvard was study. But if I take that out, take the object out, doesn't have to be there. It's part of the nature of verbs that often you get kind of two versions of a verb, one where there is an object and one where the object isn't there. There's actually a kind of shift that I'm not showing here in the meaning of some kind, but it's not a big one. What I did at Harvard was study. All of a sudden, that's fine, right? Because why? Because, well, the object isn't even there. It's not part of the verb phrase. My rule says focus on. So it's interesting, right? You cannot take out and focus on just the word study if the object is there. Take the object out, and then it's a completely different story. I can focus on that single word. But that's because our explanation would be, well, now that single word is a V bar, not just a V. So not a V all by itself when there's it has a V bar mother and other stuff, but if I'm just a V bar, I'm a complete V bar, I'm a phrasal constituent all of a sudden, right? So therefore it's possible